because it's incredibly gratifying to see where this field has transitioned in the last 15, 20 years. I was going to talk to you about a set of slides. I actually lifted them out of one of our research papers. But given the flavor of the other talks, let me just share with you how I came to this field and why I'm particularly excited about where we are right now. As you heard, I'm a clinician scientist, I'm a biochemist, and a practicing retina specialist. But my interest is not just simply as a retina specialist or ophthalmologist. I'm very interested in nutritional biochemistry. And that happened about 6, 7 years ago in my research lab when I was at the University of Florida. I was head of retina for many years there. Now I've transitioned to private practice, but maintain my research grants, publish papers, and give talks. As I said, I'm blessed to give talks nationally and internationally. What we discovered about 6, 7 years ago, we were looking for new compounds for macular degeneration and diabetes in particular, because those are the two most common causes of blindness worldwide. And so what you can do is you can buy commercial libraries of compounds, and you can also obtain them from the National Institutes of Health, NIH. And we screened 200 to 300,000 compounds. We were the first people to do that in our field of vision biology. Now it's fairly routine. In fact, you can do this literally in a lab within a few days at most of the medical schools, I shouldn't say major. So when we did this, we discovered a set of 40 to 50 compounds that have very profound effect in cell culture. In other words, you can grow retinal cells or cells from diabetic patients in petri dishes, and you can recreate the disease basically in a petri dish. And so these compounds had a very profound effect on that, and a set of them turned out to be nutraceuticals, the active ingredients in plants and herbs and so on. And I was very skeptical about it. I'll tell you why. When I was in medical school, I was fortunate to be at Johns Hopkins. We had 2 weeks of nutrition. The kids at the University of Florida, even today, get 1 day of nutrition as part of their medical education, so you really don't get exposed to it. But regardless, I started reading about this field and reaching out to the scientists, reading the basic literature, the published literature. And what I discovered, there's a very rich body of information about nutritional biochemistry, dating back almost at least a couple hundred years ago in the published medical literature, and some of you are aware in certain medical traditions like Indian Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, traditional Russian medicine, traditional South American medicine, or African medicine. A lot is known about these natural products and supplements. So in any case, as my interest and my understanding deepened, I had a great awareness of this field. And I want to tell you about a couple things that make this opportunity where all of you are with Uforia right now, at a precipice in both academics and in terms of the opportunity to impact and help people's health. So what is that precipice? So some years ago, here in Texas actually, at the University of Texas in Austin, there was a very famous biochemist. He passed away some years ago, Dr. Roger Williams. He's the first one, as far as I can tell, or all of us who are involved in this field can tell, who spoke of biochemical individuality. This was long before we fully understood SNPs, or these small DNA changes that you just heard about. And he was speaking as a biochemist at that time and wrote a whole series of papers. In fact, by the way, he's the one who helped discover vitamin B5, B6, folic acid. In fact, he's the one who named it folic acid. He's also the one who discovered alpha-lipoic acid. Made it a tremendous contribution to our understanding of nutritional medicine or nutritional biochemistry. But the point, though, is in 1956, when he published this book, he already had understood from his own lab's work, which is just absolutely genius and brilliant, that this concept of biochemical individuality is what drives the differences in all of us, and why here we are in 2018 about to be able to impact it by looking at actionable genes, as you heard, or actionable SNPs. That turns out to be a very profound 50, 60 years in modern medicine, because you've heard about the genomics revolution, you've heard about the wonderful advances in molecular biochemistry and molecular genetics and molecular biology as well in that span of time. But what we are able to do now is just simply remarkable. And I wanted to, before I tell you that, and these remarkable ingredients that we have, I'm happy to talk with any of you afterwards. You can tell I'm not a very passionate person per se. But if you want to talk about any of these ingredients, in fact, each of these ingredients deserves 2-3 hour discussion in and of itself. I mean, they're simply remarkable. But what I wanted to really share with you is, you heard someone else spoke earlier, and I'm trying to tie some of the pieces of what you had heard earlier this morning, about this concept of balance in a cell. And what I want you to start thinking about, or realizing the framework to which Uforia ascribes to, is the following. So all of us, our cells are in balance when we don't have a disease, right? Or a dis-ease, right? So the cell's in balance. And then we have a stressor. What are the stressors? It's the food we take, right? And that's another fun conversation to have about how poor our nutrition is. Just as a sidebar, 80% of Americans are deficient in the 41 essential vitamins and minerals that are required for our living, right? These RDAs that you may have heard of that are published, those are really not that useful, by the way, per se. So 80% of us are deficient. That's independent of how our bodies metabolize the food and nutrition in our body, because that's controlled by our genetics. So there's two stressors, right? So one is the food we take. By the way, the food that we consume is profoundly inflammatory, right? People have studied this. Let me just give you a small little sidebar. It turns out at the University of Maryland many years ago, they recruited a set of medical students for this study. They all went to McDonald's, and they ate a Happy Meal, right? I'm not so sure their bodies were so happy, but regardless, afterwards they recorded, like some of these SNPs that we're talking about. You heard about IL-6, CRP, which are involved in inflammation, profoundly high after a Happy Meal, and it stayed high for 24 hours. That's very disturbing, and I'll tell you why it's disturbing, because of every single chronic disease you can think of in humans, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, glaucoma, macular degeneration, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, coronary artery disease, osteoarthritis, 70% of cancers, they're controlled by nutrition, and specifically they're controlled by chronic low-grade inflammation as the nexus around which that disease process develops. The tissues are different, but the fundamental biochemical events that lead to the disease are canonically the same in every single one of these diseases that I just described to you. So that's on one side. Now the other side is this. So now you have a cell that's out of balance, right? And if we can maybe show this one slide, that'd be great. What happens, now this is a busy slide, and I just want to tell you what the key point is. As I said, comes from one of our research papers. So think of this as a cell on the left-hand side, and you see those ovals of various colors. Those are representing certain cellular pathways. You don't need to remember any names at all. But the point is this, is these major cellular pathways that control the balance of a cell are the same that you find in bacteria as you find in human cells. So nature conserved those. And what happens is these pathways are connected to each other. So it's like this. They're like a bunch of springs that are connected to each other, and you jigger one of the springs, all the other springs vibrate. And they vibrate because they're trying to maintain the balance, because the cell's being insulted by nutrition, right? Or what we consume, and also our genetics, right? So that opportunity to affect these stressors, which affects balance, if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. So here's a cell in balance, right? I don't want you to remember any of these names that are shown here. These are some of the cellular pathways. And any of you who are interested in talking about the gory details of this, I'm happy to discuss it afterwards. But go to the next slide. So here we are in balance. Go to the next one. And now, here's what happens in a disease state, or chronic. Now, I know we don't want to use the word treating a disease, but what we can talk about in the context of nutrition is returning the cell and the body into balance. And you do that by first identifying those external stressors, right, that's shown up there, again, what we consume, and then our genetic predispositions or genetic weaknesses. That's the genome testing, right? And those coupled together, we can then return, the teeter-totter that's out of balance, we can return it back into balance. Now, the ability to not only identify those genetic imbalances and also identify extremely high-quality ingredients that can address those genetic imbalances is both the challenge and the opportunity for a company like Uforia. Now, the challenges we can actually is to create those products, because the SNP testing you heard from Mike earlier this morning, Mike Phelps, that's very possible to do in a very rigorous environment. But this ability to now couple genomic testing and then allow precision, this word precision medicine, some of you may have heard, this is what it really means, is to be able to then directly solve a patient's problems or genetic weaknesses. Now that turns out to be very, very exciting for many, many reasons, right? Because it's the first time we have the opportunity to do something individual, that same biochemical individuality that Roger Williams talked about in 1956 and published on in 1956. Here we are in 2018 with the opportunity to profoundly affect people's health and well-being. Now, I want to leave you with, because I know I have about 1 minute left, right? I want to leave you with this framework. So I just want to summarize what I've said. First, we're biochemically individual. We all biochemically and genetically individual, or individualized, as it were. And then second is we are able to measure both the biochemical changes and the genomic changes in our DNA in each patient. Third, we have high quality ingredients that can attack these genetic weaknesses. Now, and there's a corollary to this final point. It turns out, so people think, oh my gosh, I have this genomic predisposition to Alzheimer's disease, for example, right? Or to macular degeneration, or to high blood pressure. That is not the final verdict. It turns out there's other wonderful published papers by a close friend of mine, Dr. Bruce Ames out at Berkeley, who showed many years ago that you can actually overwhelm a genetic weakness with appropriate nutritional supplementation. His old concept, some of you may have heard of it, it's called triage theory. If you want to talk about it afterwards, I'm happy to discuss the biochemical details of that as well. But this whole idea that you can now treat with nutrition genetic weaknesses in such a way that you can outrightly prevent and or reverse disease. Now that's, again, we don't want to use the word disease per se, but returning the way to frame it to potential patients or physicians is, it's not necessarily reversing disease, but it's returning this body back into balance. Okay, my very last point. We heard one of the speakers talked about structure and function. So it turns out that as physicians, we only do two things. We measure structure or function, right? Whether it's a retina specialist like myself, a cardiologist or neurologist, whoever it is. Now here's what I want you to remember. It turns out structure and function are directly correlated with each other when body or human being or a cell is in balance. Soon as there's a stressor that's placed on the cell or human being, they become discorrelated. In other words, structure doesn't correlate with function. And the way to return back to a balanced state, in other words, where structure and function correlate with each other, is through nutrition, or targeted nutrition in particular. So I'll end on that. I'm happy to chat with other folks. I'm very grateful to being here. Thank you so much.